Women are not as obsessed with control and power and domination as men are.
Women generally don't commit crimes this heinous. This is usually the domain of men.
That's unfortunate. Oh yeah, equal opportunity, definitely.
He said, "Oh, I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die."
That's okay.
Boom.
Throughout the night, you can hear him calling out in his room. He was yelling that I love you and I'm sorry.
Will you kill again?
If the opportunity arises, I hope so.
When women kill, it's shocking because as a society, we are all socialized to expect certain stereotypic behaviors in women. They're congenial, they play nicely, they know how to be cooperative, and they certainly aren't violent.
People are used to thinking of men as the part of the species that's aggressive and kills people or does something violent. When people think of women who've killed someone, it's alarming to them. It sort of violates the norm of sugar and spice and all things nice. That's what girls are made of, right? We would prefer to believe that women are not violent. But it's not true. From a scientific perspective, most studies on psychopathy have been conducted in male prisoners. So the data are skewed. Right now, we tend to think of women being a small percentage of psychopathic killers. But I do think there's a greater number than we imagine. I think that as a group, female psychopaths, they're both overlooked and they're underestimated.
Over the years, popular culture has assigned labels to particularly heinous crimes that have been committed by females that have been thought to be psychopaths. We're going to examine some of the unique characteristics of female psychopathy and explore the horrific crimes that they've committed.
So normally if you use the term vigilante, people will think of a man, maybe even a cowboy film from the West. People will generally think of it as a man who's a vigilante trying to seek justice, Zorro. They don't think right away a woman. And that's why the female psychopath who is a vigilante flies under our radar.
Vigilante is both judge and jury, and they decide who lives and who dies. And while we see male psychopaths that have that vigilante justice streak in their crimes, we do see that more often with female psychopathic offenders. One of the more notorious or well-known vigilante psychopaths is Aileen Wuornos.
By her own admission, Wuornos was a hitchhiking highway who killed 7 motorists in 1 year.
I still say to myself, I still say that it was a self-defense.
It's shocking because women who use extreme violence are rare. And so, as human beings, we are always attracted to or respond to things which are rarer. We idealize womanhood in very stereotypical and unrealistic ways, which then leads to the flip, where we then sensationalize their violence. So men's violence is normalized, and women's violence is sensationalized.
When Wuornos is initially caught, she claims that she killed these men because she was sexually assaulted by them, she was physically beaten by them. But the evidence just doesn't support that. What we know is some of the victims were actually shot in the back. To make matters worse, Wuornos stole their cars, she stole their wallets, and robbery was a secondary gain.
Aileen is a woman who has an upbringing that is not trauma-free. She has a history of abuse and decides that it would be fine to rid the world of men who then solicit sex workers. So she's able to seduce men with the promise of having sex with them and then killing them. It's her way of cleaning up the world. From a psychoanalytic perspective, she's paying the world back for whatever abuse she suffered. There's also a sense of gratification. They're fulfilling a fantasy of something that they want. We see similar justification in another female psychopath, Angela Simpson.
Wow, I killed Terry.
How and why?
I killed Terry
by deceptively luring him to apartment 201, sitting him down, and beating him with various objects until he was unconscious, and then I slit his throat. I told him upstairs, when I do give you some, I do because that's what he kept asking me to do. Would you please? Oh, yeah.
Is that what he thought he was going to get?
Exactly. That's why I deceptively lured him up there.
The use of sex or promises of sexual favors and sexual interactions or flirting is a strategy that female offenders do use more so than male psychopathic offenders. In the case of both Wuornos and Simpson, we see that they were able to use this tool of promises of sex and sexual favors to lure their victims in. Ultimately, in the process, these women found a way to access them when their guards were down, and they were in essentially their most vulnerable state.
Why?
Why? Because Terry told me that he was an informant. He said that he met with the DA periodically, still, regarding cases that are, I don't know, 10 to 16 years old, crazy. I proceeded to beat him to death.
With the tire iron?
Tire iron, a stick, a hammer. Yes, I did have my hammer.
There's no evidence that the victim was ever an informant. Simpson's outlook is that she is superior to most people in that she gets to decide who's a snitch. She gets to decide if they live or die.
Simpson is describing her act of killing men. It's so matter of fact while she's eating, just mentioning that she has stabbed, tortured him, as if it's the same thing as asking for potato chips or a Diet Coke. There's nothing shocking about it. And this is one of the traits that we do talk about in psychopathy, that people have low empathy and that they seem callous and indifferent to other human life. And this is a feature that we don't automatically associate with women.
I was very high just on the act alone, dude.
Men are usually thought of as being stronger, bigger, and more dominating of women. And in this situation, she's flipped the power dynamic. It's the male who is helpless and who is bound, and she is fully in control of everything that will happen to him, including his death.
We've all heard the phrase that hell hath no fury like a woman that's scorned. Generally, female psychopaths tend to be less physically violent and more interpersonally aggressive and manipulative than male psychopaths. However, when women psychopaths are betrayed or rejected, sometimes they do become violent, as we'll see in the case with Jodi Arias.
To ask you this. Did you kill Travis Alexander?
Absolutely not. No, I had no part in it.
But a police report shows forensic evidence tying Arias to the murder. Alexander was stabbed 27 times, shot once, and his throat was cut open.
Jodi Arias, upon hearing that her ex-boyfriend was going to be going away with another woman, became triggered because it was the ultimate rejection for her. Basically, it said, he's moved on, and now she no longer has control over him.
While rejection is difficult for people to accept, the majority of us are able to process it, move on from it. But in the case of a female psychopath who is violent, their ability to handle rejection and their ability to regulate their emotions of anger and loss and grief really are significantly lacking.
Was he alive when he was stabbed in the heart?
Yes.
Was he alive, in your opinion, when his throat was slit?
Yes.
Normally, when we hear that term about scorn, we always think of a romantic relationship where people have been attached and then the relationship's fallen apart. But it can be more broad than that. A person doesn't have to be in a romantic relationship to feel vengeance is necessary and needed. And a nice example of that is actually in the Sidabaka case.
dead?
Should he be?
Yes.
If he was dead, why would he be dead? From what?
Killing him. I was getting dressed because you can't go like that because it looks like you're ghetto in this. Made me mad.
And then what happened?
Went and shot him. He said,
Oh, I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die.
that's okay. Boom.
Sidibaka is in her early 60s, and she's had a history of a stroke. She's living with her daughter and her son-in-law, and when he speaks in a disparaging way about an outfit that she's wearing, her clothing, and she interprets it as a put-down of who she is as a person. It's sort of an insult that cuts right to the core, that is disrespectful. We might say in psychiatry that this is a narcissistic injury, and with a psychopath, that's particularly dangerous.
How many rounds do you remember firing?
15.
Did he say anything to you?
Grandma, I love you.
After you shot him, and what did you do?
Went to Denny's.
The complete lack of remorse that she's showing is somewhat stunning, particularly given her age as a female. When you look at Cynthia Sidibaka, you think of somebody's grandmother. You think of a kind, gentle person who wants to nurture her family, who has a softness about her, and there's nothing soft or gentle about Cynthia Sidibaka. She is a female psychopathic offender who just killed her son-in-law.
He's dead, isn't he?
Yeah, he did.
Good. I shot him. Boom, boom, boom. Oh, thank you. Thank you to take me whenever. Oh, God. Oh, God.
In our culture and society, oftentimes elderly women are invisible. They're not seen as authority figures. They're also not seen as sexual creatures or as attractive individuals any longer. Female psychopathic offenders oftentimes are aware about how society perceives them, as well as the stereotypical expectations of how a female will behave. And that isn't any more true than Dorothea Puente.
Police have finally caught up with Dorothea Puente. She is the woman who is suspected of killing 7 people and burying them in the yard of her boarding house in Sacramento for their Social Security checks.
I have not killed anyone. I told you that. I have not killed anyone. The checks I cashed, yes.
Puente flew under the radar and wasn't detected for quite some time because, first of all, she disguised herself. Puente was only in her 50s, but she let herself look different and older than she really was. And she was also somebody who ran this boarding home. People looked at her as a caregiver. So nobody was suspecting what she was doing, that she was in fact a serial killer. Another individual who used her identity and her occupation as a caregiver to avoid detection was Elizabeth Wetlofter.
I knew the difference between right and wrong, but I thought this was something that God or whoever wanted me to do. They could be a bit of a handful. He would grab the nurse's breast and buttocks, but he did touch me inappropriately once.
Run me through.
About 9:30, I gave him a dose of 50 milligrams of insulin. Non-diabetic. So throughout the night, he was yelling out, "I love you," and "I'm sorry." And then at 3:30, the doctor came in and said that his cause of death was from an embolism due to his closed hip. And afterwards, I did feel a release, like a release of pressure.
We go to the hospital, we think the people who are there, or to a nursing home, they're there to help us. They don't abuse people, they certainly don't kill them. And then her type of psychopathy is centered around this notion. We can think of the angel of mercy type of serial killer. What she'll say to other people is, they shouldn't live that long, or I'm helping them along. Although when we look at her statements more closely, we end up finding that there's more than meets the eye.
What's different about the way female psychopaths engage in violent behavior versus male psychopaths is that when they are violent, sometimes it's a little more discreet, whereas we might expect a male to stab someone or shoot someone. In this case, it's much more subtle, and it also makes it more difficult to detect.
So in the case of Ms. Wetlaufer, she is in a system that also facilitates her access to people and her access to drugs. And we do know that women who kill may be more likely to use poisons or medications. For many female psychopaths who kill, they'll choose a poison or choose something that's not violent. And so for a psychopath who's working in a healthcare system, it fits in a very hand-in-glove sort of way that there are drugs available that are normal, but in certain doses are lethal. So they're not obvious poisons. They have access to them. They can administer them to people. And it makes the deaths usually go unnoticed. They're attributed to either death of natural causes or something else. And this does fit with what we know, at least in part, about female psychopaths. If they choose to kill, it tends to be a less violent method.
She just got harder and harder to look after, and one night when I had to look after her, I started getting the feeling about a surge again. So, yeah, I overdosed her.
When you work in a nursing facility, you're expecting patients to have some behavioral and or emotional difficulty. She's accepted a role as a nurse, as a caregiver to people who need help, and she's ultimately using that to kill people. She's a great example of a female psychopath. She's using her knowledge and her role as a caregiver to kill someone in a way that's very discreet and could have flown under the radar for who knows how many more victims had she not come forward.
I decided I didn't want to nurse anymore. I didn't want to hurt anybody anymore.
While Wetlaufer was the caregiver to all of her victims, it's important to note that she didn't kill them on day one. She facilitated a relationship with them, she bonded with them, and ultimately poisoned them.
Another distinction between male and female psychopaths is their motive. Male psychopaths may have a motive such as sexual gratification or pleasure, for example, like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy. But female psychopaths tend to have a motive toward greed and financial security and stability. The label Black Widow has been assigned to females who kill significant others or spouses to gain some sort of financial means or security. And a great example of that is Jill Coit.
This Southern belle, once a former model and beauty queen, has been married 10 times, and no less than 2 of her husbands have died in mysterious circumstances.
There was always a different person, a different man.
Her youngest son, William, doesn't remember much about his father, Clark. He was just 3 years old in 1972 when his dad was found murdered. Jill Coit was the cops' #1 suspect.
I have never murdered anyone, and I definitely did not murder Mr. Coit.
To this day, the case remains unsolved. Jill received almost $200,000 in stocks and bonds from her husband's estate.
Jill Coit is an individual who married multiple times. She married men and lured them out of money, out of their life savings, out of their homes. She got them to take care of her children while she moved on to her next victim. She made up fantastic stories to gain their sympathy.
I don't smoke or drink. I guess my greatest sin is that I get married.
Ultimately, Jill Coit ends up marrying a gentleman named Jerry Boggs. When Jerry figured out that Jill was a liar, his mission was to make sure that everybody knew that Jill Coit was a fraud. Ultimately, he sued her for fraud. 6 days before that trial was set to begin, Jill convinced her new boyfriend to dress in a disguise, women's clothing, a wig, and to enter the home and shoot and kill Jerry Boggs.
So we know that male psychopaths tend to target random victims, people they don't necessarily know. But in contrast, female psychopaths tend to target individuals they know. They develop close relationships sometimes with the very people that they're going to take advantage of. And some female psychopaths will use behavior like flirtation and sex in order to manipulate and entrap their victims. And a great example of that is Dalia DiPolito.
Listen, we had a report of a disturbance at your house, and there were shots fired. Is your husband Michael? Okay, I'm sorry to tell you, man, he's been killed. Sure you want to kill him, dude?
I'm a lot tougher than what I love.
How long have you guys been married?
Not even a year.
It's tragic. Is there anybody you can think of that would want to do this to him?
My husband's on probation for stock fraud.
Stock fraud? Was he spending time in prison?
It was for taking money. So it was a lot of money. It was $100,000 that he had to pay back. People weren't happy that he was getting on probation.
What's interesting about DiPolito's case is that she actually was working as an escort when she met her husband, and it's a transactional relationship that's mutually agreed upon.
DiPolito worked in commercial sex, which means she's repeatedly been, in some ways, dehumanized, probably exposed to violence, and probably does not think highly of men, nor see them as anything else but objects that purchase her and ill-treat her. Dalia DiPolito learned about her husband's property and life insurance before she married him. And so this is sort of a long-term plan where she seduces him, she marries him, and then she puts a hit on him to inherit property and life insurance. So it wasn't impulsive. She planned it coldly.
That's how I'm gonna do it. The robbery went bad. Now, once that's done, you know, I'll wait a few days. I'm not gonna call you right away because the police gonna be all over the Understand?
I'm a lot tougher than what I look. I know you think you're like, oh, what a cute little girl, whatever. You know, but I'm not.
When DiPolito tells the undercover officer, who she thinks is a hitman, that she's tougher than she looks, and she knows that he sees her as a cute little girl, what she's actually giving us is a little bit of insight and awareness into what she knows about how to manipulate others. While DiPolito believes she's going to walk out of this as a single rich lady, she's about to find out that her reality is absolutely not coming true.
Come here, please. Come here. Mike, come here.
Can't.
Why not? I didn't do anything.
I heard you.
Mike, come here, please.
So despite being obviously caught, you don't see the remorse that you would expect to see. She's actually trying to regain control of the situation and manipulate her husband again, and she's almost playing the victim.
Oftentimes, society doesn't find it hard to see women as fragile and frail, the damsel in distress, that victim that needs rescuing. But when you have a female psychopath who knows that about society and uses that to their advantage, what you might actually have is not a damsel in distress, but a stone-cold killer, like the case of Pamela Smart.
We had sex.
By that you mean intercourse?
Yeah, we made love.
In court today, Smart admitted to having a steamy affair with a teenage student, but eventually tried to break it off. Defendant says the student, William Flynn, was so distraught at the prospect of not seeing her that he threatened to kill himself, but ended up killing her husband.
Do you want this jury to understand that Bill Flynn decided to kill your husband because you broke up with him?
I don't know why Bill Flynn killed Greg. I can just come in here and give my testimony.
So even as you sit here today, you still have no idea why he may have done this. Is that it?
I didn't say I had no idea, but I don't know specifically.
Well, I'm asking you, what do you think? Why do you think he did this?
Probably because he thought we could be together.
There are several characteristics of psychopathy that we can see in this scenario with Pamela Smart. First of all, she is failing to accept any responsibility for this. Second of all, there is no remorse. There's no indication that she feels bad that her husband was killed in the first place. It's rather cold and callous in the way she talks about it. There is no emotion behind it. It's really, if anything, she feels indignant and seemingly upset with the student for sending her to prison.
The damsel in distress ruse that female psychopaths can use can be very effective. An example in the case of Jennifer Pan, who used the ruse quite effectively initially, but it didn't work in the end.
Help me, please. I need help. I don't know my parents. Some people broke into our house.
Okay, you heard gunshots?
They had guns, and they were holding me at gunpoint.
Please?
Dad?
I, upstairs in my room, called it a night with the TV on. I believe that was around 9:30 or so. Suddenly, I could hear the voices. And a guy was there, and he came at me and had string in his hands and tied my arms back and said, I have a gun behind your back. Do what I say. If you do what I say, then no one will get hurt. Where is the money? Show me where your money is. And then I heard 2 pops. My mom screamed. I yelled out for her. And at that point, I had my phone on me, behind me, that I had hidden there that they didn't know about. I whipped up the phone and I called 911. But I still hadn't heard anything from my mom, and all I could hear was my dad running on the street, moaning and making sounds.
She keeps holding her hand over her heart. She speaks in a soft voice, is trying to cry at times. She looks vulnerable. We do have that instinct as humans to try and help another human in distress. And so it's effective as a ruse because it lets the psychopath go undetected if we think we're helping the victim and we don't realize we're actually helping the murderer. But it doesn't take long for the detectives to figure out that something doesn't quite add up.
Stand up and turn around. Put this in the side that you believe it was in. Put your hands behind your back, exactly how you remember they were.
They tied my upper arm around the banister, but my hands were bound together.
So now how can you get to the phone, and how do you make the phone call?
You made me, now I feel like I've said something wrong.
We find out that for the last 4 or 5 years, she has been leading a double life, one which she has constructed intricately The parents believe that she's going to pharmacy school, she is gaining a degree, that things are going beautifully. And then in the real life, she's really not doing anything. And we discover that her parents strongly disapproved of her boyfriend, who has a criminal record and is a drug dealer.
You admittedly lied. You've lied to your parents about going to school. Who's to say this whole thing isn't a lie? Because if you are lying, it's the most cold-blooded thing that I've ever faced in my life.
I think the parents were probably going to cut her off and not give her any money. And then we see the reactive rage to that. So an additional element of psychopathy is the parasitic lifestyle, we call it, meaning that they will live off of other people. And in Pan's case, she wants her parents' money. She's been enjoying living off their money. She has been a parasite. She's lying to them to get all the benefits of living with them, as long as she can get everything else that she wants.
Pan says he saw his daughter Jennifer untied, whispering back and forth with one of the intruders, and he described that conversation as soft and friendly. He says he could hear his wife begging for their daughter's safety. "Don't hurt her," she cried. And then the trigger was pulled.
She worked with her boyfriend to set up a murder, and he had hired men to come into the house and kill her parents. She could no longer keep up the lies, so that her entire world was going to collapse.
To want to hear your parents get killed, or to see it, rather than asking someone to come in and kill her parents while she's away, it means she's much more callous and cold-hearted. We say that of lacking empathy in psychopathy.
When we think about parent and child relationships, in the case of Jennifer Pan, parents don't think that their children would ever harm them. As they get older, they put trust in their children to take care of them, to care for them, and to remain watchful. We also think of parent-child relationships in the reverse, that parents are charged with keeping their children safe, except in the cases of female psychopathic killers, what we think of in popular culture as mommy dearest. And that couldn't be more obvious than in the case of Susan Smith.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home.
In 1994, Susan Smith got on national television and pleaded with the person who supposedly had carjacked her with her 2 young children sleeping in the back. But what we now know, tragically, is that while she was on national television pleading for the return of her children, Susan Smith the whole time knew that her children were dead at the bottom of a lake.
She wanted to be in a new romantic relationship, and the man she was interested in was not interested in dating a woman with young children. Susan Smith strapped her children into their car seats and let the car essentially roll into a body of water where they slowly drowned.
For a woman to turn around and kill her kids is not right. There's no way to explain it. You can't even understand it.
It's shocking because, in fact, women who use extreme violence are quite rare. We are primed as a culture to be more in shock when women are violent, where we normalize men's violence. If someone has psychopathic traits and they become a mother, it might change things for a little while. And the part that's narcissistic, she might be excited at the idea of creation or birth. But once the reality comes in, the deep personal sacrifices, the loss of time, where you put your money, the perhaps absence of attention from potential partners, it immediately and quickly becomes less exciting.
To be a successful, effective parent, your children's needs oftentimes come before your own. And in the case of Elaine Campione, that was something that smacked her in the face when she and her husband separated, and he filed for full custody of both of their daughters.
And everything, God, I hate you. I truly, truly hate you.
So what happened last night?
Sophia was having a bath. It's like this usual routine that we always take.
So what happens when she's finished her bath?
She gets out of the tub and I dried her off. She was really, really tired. So I just got her in her pajamas and put her into bed. And then I went up to the living room, was cleaning up everything. I had took a bunch of pills.
Elaine Campione's sense of self-worth, her identity, and her entire sense of self was based on the idea that she was this perfect mother. She was doting over the children, she was a loving mother, and ultimately, her ex-husband's decision to leave the family was not just a rejection of her, but it was him rejecting her daughters. This is Campione's narrative. So her ex-husband now files for full custody in court. So in her mind, Elaine Campione only has one choice.
I was getting really retired. I curled up with Sophia. She was cold. Usually they turn and cuddle in with me. They weren't cuddling in with me. And Sophia had weird colored lips. And I looked at Serena, and she was looking weird too. And that's when I thought there was something wrong.
What she's essentially describing are the postmortem effects of her having drowned them to death. And after Elaine Campione drowns each of her daughters and then dresses them up in cute little princess dresses, curls their hair, and puts them to bed, dead. And while it may seem like Elaine Campione is having a psychotic episode and she's out of touch with reality, what we know from the rest of the case file is this was just another example of Campione's attempts to manipulate investigators.
At any point, did you push her under the water?
These are my babies. I've been trying to teach them not to be scared of the water.
Did you kill both of them?
I cannot speak without an attorney present.
So her performance appears theatrical. It appears as if she's saying what she thinks will help her manipulate the situation. She's acting the way she thinks might be helpful for her, pretending as if she has no idea what's going on. She actually very clearly does just a few minutes later whenever she asks for a lawyer.
Hey, Serena, who loves ya?
Mommy.
Who loves you the most? That much? Oh, I think I love you more than that.
She created this video of her girls just before she murdered them. She's presenting herself as this very loving mother. It's almost like she wanted to create this to further hurt her ex-husband, to show him, look at your beautiful girls, look how much we loved each other, and then she murdered them. So it's another way for her to exact callous vengeance against him for seeking custody.
Recording this because Leo and Bear made out me. Everything's gone. I hate you. I truly, truly hate you. You didn't care about our babies. You didn't care about me. You care about yourself. All you did was hurt us. You were an evil, horrible man. And I'm just going to God, because God is the only one who cares and who can protect me. Because you are the devil, Leo. You are the psychotic devil. At least the girls and I will be together in heaven, protected and safe from you.
She ended up taking a handful of pills, and by all accounts, it appears she did not expect to wake up. And this was really her last memorialization of what kind of mom she was and what she wanted to be the narrative. And consistent with what we see with many psychopathic individuals, her need to remain in control of the narrative prevailed right up until the end.
Becoming a parent doesn't stop you from being a psychopath. You can still have psychopathic behaviors and tendencies no matter what role you have in a family. She manipulated her ex-husband and used their children as pawns. They were her tools, unfortunately, to exact harm against her ex-husband.
There are female killers, and yes, they're very violent, but they are rare. I think that's important to say. 80 to 90% of homicides are committed by men, and the remaining homicides that are committed by women, most of it is in self-defense. That is not true of men.
It's important to focus on cases of women who are psychopaths because it's a cultural blind spot. It helps us remember that there are female psychopaths and there's male psychopaths, and that to be equally protected against both, I think we need to be able to look for those signs and understand how sometimes cultural stereotypes will blind us right away to seeing those signs.
The female psychopath, while it is a seemingly rare population, what we also do know, which is somewhat humbling, is that the female psychopath may go more undetected. What makes them more dangerous is that they blend in. They are upstanding members of society on the surface. They hold leadership positions. They are sometimes the backbone and fiber of social organizations. And they also go undetected because of how they're able to navigate their crimes. They tend to use their interpersonal relationships and willingness to manipulate others in a manner that allows them to identify and prey on their victims more easily than men. And as a result, it may also be part of why they avoid detection.
Are you remorseful?
Not at all.
Why?
Why would I be? What's the difference? Everybody has a reason to kill.
On August 3rd, 2019, Patrick Wood-Crusius drove from Allen, Texas, to El Paso, a journey of hundreds of miles that would end with one of the deadliest acts of mass violence in the United States in recent years. His destination was the Cielo Vista Walmart, a large store in a city situated close to the United States-Mexico border. Inside that Walmart were ordinary people going about their lives. By the end of the attack, 22 people would be dead and 22 more would be injured. One of those injured victims would later die on April 25, 2020, bringing the confirmed death toll to 23. The numbers are stark, but numbers alone cannot explain what happened in El Paso. They cannot explain why that particular city was chosen, why that particular store became a target, or how an individual who had not previously been known as a violent criminal arrived at a point where he was prepared to kill people because of who he believed they were. Those questions would become central to the investigation of Patrick Crusius. And unlike some cases in which investigators spend years trying to identify an unknown killer or determine an uncertain motive, this case contains something unusually direct, a document written by the attacker himself and uploaded to the internet only minutes before the shooting began. The document was titled The Inconvenient Truth. According to the information established later in court, it expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. Crusius believed that Hispanic people were responsible for what he described as a cultural and ethnic replacement. His decision to travel to El Paso was therefore not random. The city itself was part of his reasoning. He believed it contained a large Hispanic population, and he chose it because of that fact. What happened at the Walmart was consequently more than an act of indiscriminate violence. According to Crusius's later admission, he targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. That distinction would become essential to the federal case against him. It would establish the attack not only as a mass killing, but as a federal hate crime. To understand the case, however, it is important to begin before the shooting. The attack did not emerge from a single moment of sudden violence. According to the federal indictment, preparations had already begun in June 2019. Crusius purchased a GPWASR 10 semi-automatic rifle through the internet. He also obtained approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition. These facts would later form part of the evidence showing that the attack had been planned in advance. The purchases mattered because they placed the weapon and ammunition in his possession before the journey to El Paso. The journey itself mattered because it connected the preparation to the eventual target. Cruzes lived in Allen, Texas, while the city he selected was hundreds of miles away. He did not simply encounter the Walmart by chance. He traveled there deliberately. And before the shooting began, he took another step that would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. He uploaded the inconvenient truth to the internet. According to his later guilty plea, the document was posted only minutes before the attack. It provided investigators with a direct connection between his ideological beliefs and the violence that followed. In many criminal investigations, motive has to be reconstructed from fragments. Investigators may examine a suspect's history, relationships, communications, purchases, movements, or statements and attempt to determine what drove the crime. In the Cruzes case, the evidence of motive was unusually explicit. The document existed before the attack. The journey to El Paso followed a deliberate choice of location. The target was a Walmart in a city that Cruzes associated with a large Hispanic population. And years later, when confronted with the federal charges, Cruzes would admit that he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The significance of those admissions would extend far beyond the question of why he had chosen El Paso. They would become the foundation for federal hate crime charges. But on the morning of August 3, 2019, none of that was yet known to the people inside Cielo Vista Walmart. They were not participants in an ideological argument. They were not symbols in a political debate. They were people who became targets of a deliberate act of violence. 23 of them would ultimately lose their lives. Their names would later appear in official records: Andre Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo Garcia, Guillermo Garcia, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, María Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juárez, María Legarreta Roté, Maribel Loya Hernández, Iván Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Margie Record, Sarah Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sanchez, and Juan Velasquez. At first, the official death toll was 22. The later death of an injured victim on April 25, 2020, changed that number to 23. That change is more than a detail of record-keeping. It illustrates how the consequences of a mass shooting can continue long after the gunfire has stopped. The immediate event may last only a short period of time, but the investigation, the legal process, and the human consequences can continue for years. In the aftermath of the shooting, law enforcement faced a series of questions that would gradually transform the attack from a chaotic crime scene into a documented federal case. Investigators from the FBI, the El Paso Police Department, the ATF, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and law enforcement agencies in Allen and Dallas would work to reconstruct what had happened. They needed to establish where Cruzes had come from, how he had prepared, where the weapon had been obtained, how he had traveled to El Paso, why he had selected the Walmart, and what relationship existed between his written statement and the killings. Most importantly, they needed to establish whether the victims had been selected because of their ethnicity or perceived national origin. The evidence would eventually answer those questions. Cruzes did not carry out a prolonged escape after the shooting. According to the case information, he left the Walmart but then approached police and was arrested shortly afterward. That moment marked the transition from the attack itself to the investigation that would follow. The immediate danger had ended, but the work of understanding the crime had only begun. Investigators would reconstruct the preparation. Prosecutors would examine the ideological document. The death toll would eventually rise from 22 to 23. and the legal case would grow into an indictment containing 90 federal counts. Yet before the numbers, before the indictment, before the guilty plea and the eventual sentences, there was one fundamental fact that could not be changed by any courtroom proceeding. On August 3, 2019, people entered the Cielo Vista Walmart and did not return home. The investigation that followed would determine why they had been targeted. The courts would determine Patrick Crusius's legal responsibility. But the center of the story remains with those who were killed and those who survived. Their lives, rather than the ideology of the man who attacked them, are the reason this case must be remembered. Before Patrick Crusius became the central figure in the investigation, before the federal indictment, before the courtroom and the sentences, there were the people whose lives were taken inside the Cielo Vista Walmart. Their names are known, but the information available about them in this case is limited. That limitation matters. A responsible account of a tragedy should not fill gaps in the historical record with invented biographies, imagined conversations, or assumptions about what individual victims were thinking in their final moments. What can be established is that 23 people ultimately died as a result of the attack. 22 were initially recorded as dead, and another victim who had survived the shooting for a time later died on April 25, 2020. The final list of victims recorded by the U.S. Department of Justice is not simply a statistic. It is a list of 23 individual people: Andre Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo García, Guillermo García, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, María Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juárez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernández, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Márquez, Margie Recard, Sara Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodríguez, Teresa Sánchez, and Juan Velázquez. Each name represents a person whose life existed independently of the crime that eventually became associated with them. Yet in the immediate aftermath, those individual lives were transformed into numbers on reports. The dead, the injured, the witnesses, the families waiting for information. That is one of the difficult realities of mass violence. A person who was once known through relationships, memories, work, family, and ordinary routines can become, in the public record, one name among many. The responsibility of telling this story is therefore to resist allowing the number to erase the individual. At first, the number was 22. That was the initial confirmed death toll following the shooting. But the story did not end there. One person who had been injured eventually died on April 25, 2020, changing the official total to 23. The passage from 22 to 23 also demonstrates how the consequences of violence can continue beyond the moment of the attack. For those who were killed immediately, the consequences were final. For those who survived the shooting, there were injuries and the continuing effects of having been caught inside a deliberate act of violence. The information available for this account does not provide individual medical histories or detailed personal testimonies, and so those details should not be invented. What can be said with certainty is that 22 people were injured and that the attack affected far more people than the final death count alone can describe. Families, survivors, witnesses, investigators, and an entire community were left to deal with the consequences. To understand why these people became targets, the story must also return to the place where the attack occurred. El Paso is a city in Texas situated close to the United States-Mexico border. For most people, its geographic position is simply a fact about the city. For Patrick Crusius, according to the evidence presented in his case, that geography became part of the reason he selected it. Crusius had developed white nationalist beliefs and anti-immigrant views directed toward Hispanic people. He believed that Hispanic people were responsible for what he described as a cultural and ethnic replacement. That belief influenced his decision to travel from Allen to El Paso. In other words, the location was not incidental. The city represented, In his mind, a population he had already reduced to an ideological category. This distinction is essential when considering the victims. They were not selected because Crusius knew them personally. There is no evidence in the supplied case information that he had individual relationships with the people he killed. Instead, according to his later admission, he targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The victims therefore became targets not because of anything they had personally done to him, but because the attacker had assigned them a collective identity. That is the foundation of the federal hate crime case. It also explains why the investigation focused so closely on motive. A mass shooting can involve many different possible motives. Investigators must determine whether a suspect acted because of a personal dispute, financial motive, political belief, hatred, or another reason. In this case, the evidence pointed toward an ideological motive that had been expressed before the attack and later acknowledged by Crusius himself. The document known as The Inconvenient Truth was particularly significant. Crusius uploaded it to the internet only minutes before the shooting. The document expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. It also described the ideas that he used to justify his actions. The document therefore created a connection between his beliefs and the physical location he had chosen. The attack was not merely an act committed in a city that happened to have a Hispanic population. According to the case evidence, the presence of that population was part of the reason El Paso had been selected. This is where the context becomes inseparable from the victims. The people inside the Walmart were individuals, but Crusius viewed them through the lens of an ideology that treated an entire population as a threat. The distinction between those two perspectives is central to understanding the crime. The victims did not become less individual because the attacker attempted to categorize them. They remained individuals with names, families, histories, and lives outside the crime. What changed was the way the perpetrator perceived them. His later admission made that clear. Crusius acknowledged that he killed and injured people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin, and he acknowledged that he intended to kill the people he shot. That admission removed much of the uncertainty that investigators might otherwise have faced when reconstructing the motive. It also helped transform the case from a question of what had happened into a legal determination of why it had happened. But the motive does not explain the victims themselves. It explains only the category into which the perpetrator placed them. The names remain more important than that category. Andre Anchondo and Jordan Anchondo were not simply two entries in a hate crime indictment. Arturo Benavides was not merely a count in a federal case. Neither were Jorge Calvillo Garcia, Guillermo Garcia, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglesby, Maria Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juárez, María Legarreta Roté, Maribel Loya Hernández, Iván Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Margie Record, Sarah Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sánchez, or Juan Velázquez. The available data does not give us enough information to construct complete portraits of these individuals, and it would be wrong to manufacture details simply to make the story more emotional. Their names themselves are part of the factual record. The tragedy is that they were brought together in that record by the actions of someone who had deliberately chosen a place where he believed he would encounter the population he hated. That is also why the case cannot be understood solely through the actions of the shooter. The story belongs to the victims as much as it belongs to the investigation. 23 deaths eventually became 23 murder counts in the Texas case. The same deaths became part of the federal hate crime prosecution. But behind those legal categories were 23 separate lives. Behind the 22 people who survived the shooting were injuries and experiences that the supplied data does not detail, but which nonetheless formed part of the human consequences of the attack. And behind every confirmed victim was a network of people affected by the loss. The legal system would later reduce the case to counts, pleas, sentences, and judgments because that is what a criminal prosecution must do. But before those legal structures existed, there was simply a group of people inside a Walmart who became the targets of a planned act of violence. Understanding that fact provides the necessary context for everything that follows. The investigation would eventually establish how Cruzes prepared, how he traveled, what he wrote, and why he selected El Paso. The courts would later determine his responsibility. But none of those developments changes the starting point of the story. 23 people died because Patrick Cruzes deliberately turned his ideology into violence. And 22 others were injured in the same attack. Their names are the part of the case that should remain when the statistics, legal terminology, and courtroom proceedings are stripped away. They are the human center of the story. On the morning of August 3rd, 2019, Patrick Cruzes set out from Allen, Texas, carrying with him the preparations that had been building for weeks. The journey to El Paso was not an accidental detour, and the destination was not chosen at random. According to the information established in the case, Cruzes had already decided that El Paso was the place where he wanted to carry out his attack because he believed the city had a large Hispanic population. By the time he reached the city, the decisions that would shape the rest of his life had already been made. The weapon had been acquired. The ammunition had been obtained. The ideological document had been written. And only minutes before the shooting, that document, The Inconvenient Truth, had been uploaded to the internet. What followed inside the Cielo Vista Walmart transformed those preparations into one of the deadliest mass shootings in the United States in recent years. The attack itself can be described in relatively simple terms. Cruzes entered the Walmart carrying a GPWASR, 10 semi-automatic rifle and ammunition, and began shooting at people inside. But the simplicity of that sentence should not obscure what it means. Each word represents a deliberate action, and each action was followed by consequences that would continue long after the shooting ended. 22 people were initially confirmed dead. 22 others were injured. The people inside the store had not been gathered there for any reason connected to Cruzes. They had simply become targets because of the identity he believed they represented. That distinction is critical. The case was not built around a personal dispute between the attacker and his victims. According to Cruzes' later admission, he intended to kill the people he shot and targeted them because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The violence, therefore, reflected a decision that had been made before he entered the store, to transform an ideological belief about an entire population into an act of physical violence against individual human beings. The location of the attack was central to that decision. Cielo Vista Walmart was not simply a place where Cruzes happened to encounter people. He had traveled hundreds of miles from Allen to reach El Paso, a city near the United States-Mexico border that he associated with a large Hispanic population. His selection of the city provided investigators with one of the clearest connections between his stated ideology and his actions. The attack could therefore be understood through a sequence of choices. First came the belief, then came the preparation, then the journey, then the selection of the target, and finally, the violence itself. One of the most significant facts in that sequence was the timing of the inconvenient truth. According to the later guilty plea, Cruzes uploaded the document only minutes before the shooting began. That meant investigators did not have to rely solely on statements made long after the event to understand the ideological context. The document had existed immediately before the attack. It expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants, including the belief that Hispanic people were responsible for what Cruzes described as a cultural and ethnic replacement. The document consequently became a crucial part of the evidence establishing motive. It provided a written record of the ideas that Cruzes used to justify what he was about to do. The attack itself was the point at which those ideas became irreversible. Inside the Walmart, people were killed and injured. The final death toll would eventually reach 23, but at first the number was 22. That initial figure remained the confirmed count until one of the injured victims died on April 25, 2020. The change from 22 to 23 would later become significant in the legal case because it altered the number of deaths for which Krusius could be prosecuted. But on August 3rd, the immediate reality was already devastating. 22 people had lost their lives and 22 others had been injured. The names of those who died would eventually form one of the most important parts of the official record. Andrea Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo García, Guillermo García, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, María Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juarez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernandez, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Margie Record, Sarah Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sanchez, and Juan Velasquez. There is no need to embellish their final moments to understand the seriousness of what happened. The confirmed facts are enough. They entered the Walmart. They became targets of a planned attack. They did not survive. The survivors carried the immediate consequences of the same violence. And the death of one injured victim months later demonstrated that the effects of the attack did not end when the gunfire stopped. After the shooting, Krusius left the Walmart. But according to the information provided, there was no prolonged escape or extended effort to disappear. Instead, he approached police and was arrested shortly after the attack. This detail would later become an important transition point in the case. The violence had ended, but the investigation was beginning. The questions facing investigators were now different from the questions confronting people inside the Walmart. The immediate concern had been survival. The investigative concern became explanation. Who was Patrick Krusius? Where had he come from? How had he prepared? Where had he obtained the weapon? Why had he traveled from Allen to El Paso? Why had he selected Cielo Vista Walmart? What was the significance of the document he had uploaded? And, perhaps the most important question of all, had the victims been targeted because of their ethnicity or perceived national origin? The answers would gradually emerge through a combination of evidence and Krusius's own later admissions. Investigators from the FBI, El Paso Police Department, ATF, Texas Department of Public Safety, El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and law enforcement agencies in Allen and Dallas would work to reconstruct the events leading up to the attack and the attack itself. Their investigation would not need to begin with an unknown suspect fleeing into the distance. The suspect was already in custody. The challenge was to establish the full chain of events and determine the legal meaning of what he had done. The preparation in June 2019 would become part of that chain. The purchase of the GPWSR-10 and approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition demonstrated that the violence had not been improvised entirely in the moment. The journey from Allen to El Paso established a physical connection between preparation and target. The document uploaded before the shooting provided an ideological connection, and Krusius's later admission provided an additional direct link between his stated beliefs and the people he had attacked. Together, these facts created the foundation for the investigation that followed. Yet on that morning, none of the eventual legal consequences existed. There was number 90-count indictment. There were no federal hate crime charges. There were no consecutive life sentences. There was only an attack unfolding inside a Walmart and people whose lives were suddenly in danger. That distinction is important because the legal case that came later can sometimes make the original events seem abstract. 90 federal counts, 23 deaths, 22 injuries, 90 life sentences. These numbers describe the scale of the crime, but they cannot reproduce the experience of those who were there. The facts available to this account do not provide individual witness statements or detailed descriptions of the moments inside the store. So those details cannot responsibly be invented. What can be established is enough to understand the essential sequence. Patrick Krusius traveled deliberately from Allen to El Paso. He had acquired a rifle and ammunition weeks earlier. He selected a Walmart in a city he associated with a large Hispanic population. He uploaded an ideological document shortly before the attack. He entered the store and began shooting. 22 people were initially killed and 22 were injured. One injured victim later died, bringing the total number of deaths to 23. Cruzes then left the Walmart, approached police, and was arrested. In the hours and days that followed, the question would no longer be whether a terrible act had occurred. That was already beyond dispute. The question was how all of these facts fit together, and whether the evidence could establish not only that Patrick Cruzes had committed the violence, but why he had chosen these victims and this location. That investigation would ultimately reveal a case in which preparation, ideology, target selection, and violence were connected by a clear and documented sequence. The shooting was over. The investigation was only beginning. Once Patrick Cruzes was in custody, the investigation entered a different phase. The immediate question of stopping the attacker had been answered. What remained was the much more complicated task of reconstructing the crime, how it had been prepared, why El Paso had been selected, what evidence connected the suspect to the attack, and whether the killings had been motivated by hatred toward people of Hispanic origin. Because Cruzes had been arrested shortly after the shooting, investigators did not have to begin by searching for an unidentified killer. Instead, they had to reconstruct a chain of events that stretched backward from the Cielo Vista Walmart to Allen, Texas, and ultimately to the ideas that Cruzes had expressed before the violence. Multiple agencies became involved in the investigation, including the FBI, the El Paso Police Department, the ATF, the Texas Department of Public Safety, the El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and law enforcement agencies in Allen and Dallas. Their work involved establishing the facts surrounding the attack and determining how the individual pieces of evidence fitted together. One of the first important pieces of that reconstruction was the weapon. According to the federal indictment, Cruzes had purchased a GPWASR 10 semi-automatic rifle through the internet in June 2019. He had also obtained approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow-point ammunition. These purchases were important because they demonstrated preparation before the attack. The shooting had not simply begun because of something that happened inside the Walmart that morning. The weapon and ammunition had been acquired weeks earlier. That placed part of the crime's preparation before the journey to El Paso and before the victims were ever encountered. Investigators, therefore, had to examine the timeline connecting those preparations to August 3rd. Cruzes lived in Allen, Texas, while the selected target was in El Paso, hundreds of miles away. The distance mattered. It meant that the location of the attack was the result of a deliberate decision. According to the case information, Cruzes selected El Paso because he believed it had a large Hispanic population. The city's location near the United States-Mexico border was therefore directly relevant to the motive investigators were attempting to establish. The investigation was not simply asking why someone had gone to a particular Walmart. It was asking why someone had traveled such a long distance to a city whose population corresponded to the group he had expressed hostility toward. The answer would come from several forms of evidence, but one document stood out above the rest. Shortly before the shooting, Cruzes uploaded a document called The Inconvenient Truth to the internet. According to his later guilty plea, the upload occurred only minutes before the attack. The document expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. It also contained the belief that Hispanic people were responsible for what Cruzes described as a cultural and ethnic replacement. For investigators and prosecutors, the timing was significant. The document was not simply an old statement discovered years after the crime. It had been created and published immediately before the violence. It provided a written record of the ideology that Cruzes was expressing at the moment he was about to carry out the attack. That made it an important piece of evidence in establishing motive. Still, an ideology alone would not establish every element of a criminal case. Investigators needed to connect the document to the actual conduct. The connection emerged through the sequence of events. Cruzes had expressed hostility toward Hispanic people. He had prepared a weapon and ammunition before the attack. He had traveled from Allen to El Paso. He had selected a Walmart in a city he associated with a large Hispanic population. He then opened fire on people inside the store. Later, he would admit that he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The separate pieces therefore reinforced one another. The firearm purchase established preparation. The journey established deliberate movement toward the chosen location. The document established the ideological context. And the later admission provided direct evidence of the reason he had selected his victims. The investigation also had to account for the scale of the violence. Initially, 22 people were confirmed dead and 22 others were injured. That number became legally significant because the federal prosecution was initially structured around those deaths and injuries. But the case changed when one of the injured victims died on April 25, 2020. The death increased the confirmed total to 23. That meant the legal record had to reflect a 23rd fatality. The evolution from 22 deaths to 23 was therefore not simply a statistical correction. It affected the number of people for whom prosecutors could seek accountability through the criminal case. By February 2020, a federal grand jury had returned an indictment containing 90 counts against Cruzes. The structure of the indictment reveals how investigators and prosecutors understood the crime. 23 counts involved hate crimes resulting in death. Another 23 counts involved the use of a firearm in federal violent crimes resulting in death. 22 counts involved hate crimes connected to attempted killings, corresponding to the 22 people who were injured and survived. Another 22 counts involved firearm offenses connected to those violent crimes. Together, those charges produced a total of 90 federal counts. The number may appear extraordinary at first, but it reflected the legal structure of the case. Each death and each surviving victim was represented within the indictment through specific federal charges. The prosecution was therefore treating the attack not as a single undifferentiated act of violence, but as a collection of individual criminal offenses committed against individual people. The most important turning point, however, would come not from another discovery at the crime scene, but from Cruzes himself. The evidence already established a powerful connection between the attack and the ideology expressed in the inconvenient truth. But his later admission removed another layer of uncertainty. Cruzes acknowledged that he had killed and injured people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. He also acknowledged that he intended to kill the people he shot. These admissions were central to the federal hate crime case because they directly addressed the reason for the violence. The investigation could therefore move beyond speculation about whether the attack had been motivated by racial or ethnic hatred. The perpetrator himself had acknowledged the motive. This was particularly important because the legal consequences of a hate crime differ from those of a mass shooting without such an established motive. The federal government had to prove the specific nature of the offenses charged, and the evidence had to establish the relationship between Cruzes' beliefs and his actions. His document, his preparation, his choice of El Paso, and his later admission all contributed to that picture. At the same time, investigators had to reconstruct the identities and circumstances of the victims. 23 people had ultimately died, while 22 others had been injured. Their identities became part of the official record, and each victim was represented in the subsequent prosecution. The investigation was therefore simultaneously broad and individual, broad enough to reconstruct an ideological and planned attack, but specific enough to account for each person who had been killed or injured. The agencies involved were not simply investigating why a mass shooting had happened. They were building a case that could withstand federal prosecution. By the time the indictment was issued, the essential narrative had become clear. Patrick Cruzes had prepared before the attack. He had acquired the weapon and ammunition. He had traveled from Allen to El Paso. He had selected a location because of the population he expected to encounter there. He had published The Inconvenient Truth shortly before the attack. He had then entered the Cielo Vista Walmart and opened fire. The result was 23 deaths and 22 injuries. The evidence did not require investigators to invent a hidden motive. It was documented in the attacker's own words and later reinforced by his admission. The investigation had transformed a chaotic and devastating event into a documented federal case, with 90 separate counts. But the investigation was only one stage of the story. The next question would be what Patrick Crusius would do when faced with those charges, and what punishment the courts would ultimately impose for the deaths and injuries that followed from his decisions on August 3, 2019. By the time Patrick Crusius reached the courtroom, the essential facts of the case had already been established through the investigation. The attack had taken place at Cielo Vista Walmart in El Paso on August 3, 2019. 22 people had initially been confirmed dead, 22 others had been injured, and one of those injured victims later died on April 25, 2020, bringing the confirmed death toll to 23. Investigators had reconstructed Crusius's preparation, including his purchase of a GPWSR 10 semi-automatic rifle and approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow-point ammunition in June 2019. They had documented his journey from Allen to El Paso and examined the ideological document he uploaded shortly before the shooting. And most importantly, Crusius would eventually acknowledge that he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The legal process, therefore, had to address not only the deaths and injuries themselves, but the specific federal crimes that arose from the manner in which they had been committed. The federal case became enormous in scope. In February 2020, a federal grand jury returned an indictment containing 90 counts against Crusius. The number was not arbitrary. It reflected the individual victims and the different federal offenses associated with the attack. 23 counts involved hate crimes resulting in death. Another 23 counts involved the use of a firearm in federal violent crimes resulting in death. 22 counts involved hate crimes connected to attempted killings, corresponding to the people who were injured and survived. A further 22 counts involved firearm offenses connected to those violent crimes. Together, the charges amounted to 90 federal counts. The structure of the indictment demonstrated how prosecutors were treating the attack. It was not being considered simply as one enormous act of violence represented by a single charge. Each death and each surviving victim formed part of the legal case. The 23 people who ultimately died were represented in the charges involving deaths, while the 22 injured survivors were represented through the charges connected to attempted killings and firearm offenses. This distinction was important because the criminal justice system had to account for individual acts and individual victims, even though the crimes had occurred within a single attack. The federal charges also reflected the role of motive. In an ordinary murder prosecution, the central question may be whether the accused intentionally killed another person. In this case, prosecutors were also addressing whether the victims had been selected because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The evidence concerning Crusius's ideology was therefore central to the federal hate crime allegations. His document, The Inconvenient Truth, had been uploaded only minutes before the shooting. It expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. The document was significant because it connected his stated ideology to the location he had chosen and the people he intended to target. But the case did not ultimately depend solely on the interpretation of that document. Crusius himself later admitted the motive. That admission would become decisive when the case moved toward resolution. On February 8, 2023, Patrick Crusius pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges. The plea represented a major turning point. Instead of proceeding through a lengthy federal trial in which prosecutors would have to present the evidence and establish guilt on all of the charges, Crusius formally accepted responsibility for the federal offenses. His guilty plea also acknowledged the essential facts underlying the prosecution. He admitted that he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin, and he admitted that he intended to kill the people he shot. The plea therefore confirmed the connection between the ideology documented before the attack and the violence carried out inside the Walmart. It also resolved the federal question of criminal responsibility without requiring a full trial on all 90 counts. The punishment that followed was severe. On July 7, 2023, a federal court in El Paso sentenced Cruz to 90 consecutive life sentences. 45 of those life sentences were associated with the hate crime offenses, while another 45 were associated with the firearm offenses. The sentences were imposed consecutively rather than simply being grouped into one general life term. In practical terms, the result ensured that Cruz would remain in prison for the rest of his life. Under the applicable federal sentence, there was no possibility of parole. The significance of the sentence was therefore not merely numerical. 90 consecutive life sentences communicated the scale of the federal prosecution while also ensuring that each part of the case carried its own punishment. The court's judgment represented the end of the federal criminal proceedings, but it did not mean that every legal issue connected to the attack had disappeared. Cruz still faced prosecution by the state of Texas for the murders of the 23 people who had died. This distinction between the federal and state cases is important. The federal government had prosecuted the hate crime and firearm offenses under federal law. The state of Texas separately pursued the murder charges arising from the same attack. The two proceedings therefore operated within different legal systems, even though they concerned the same underlying events. The state case continued after the federal sentence had been imposed. On April 21, 2025, Cruz pleaded guilty in Texas to 23 counts of murder. The number corresponded to the final confirmed death toll. The state court then imposed 23 life sentences. Once again, the legal record reflected the individual victims. There were 23 people who had died, and there were 23 murder charges in the state prosecution. Taken together, the federal and state sentences created an unmistakable legal conclusion. Patrick Cruz was responsible for the attack and would spend the rest of his life in prison. The federal case resulted in 90 consecutive life sentences, while the Texas case resulted in 23 additional life sentences. The sheer number of sentences can make the legal conclusion seem almost abstract. 90 is an extraordinary figure, and 23 more life sentences at the state level adds another layer of scale. But behind those numbers were the individual victims whose names had been recorded throughout the investigation and prosecution. The court process had transformed their deaths into legal counts. But the purpose of those counts was to establish accountability for individual acts against individual people. The legal system also provided a formal recognition of the motive that had driven the attack. Cruz had not simply entered a Walmart and randomly committed violence. According to his own admission, he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. That admission was consistent with the ideological document he had published immediately before the attack and with the deliberate decision to travel from Allen to El Paso. The federal hate crime charges therefore reflected an essential part of what had happened. The victims had been targeted because of an identity the attacker associated with his ideological beliefs. The legal outcome did not erase the consequences of that decision. A sentence cannot restore the lives of 23 people. It cannot undo the injuries suffered by 22 survivors. It cannot return families to the moment before the attack or remove the memory of what happened. What a sentence can do is establish responsibility within the legal system. In this case, the courts established their responsibility through guilty pleas and life sentences at both the federal and state levels. There was no uncertainty about whether Cruz would return to ordinary life. The federal sentence alone ensured that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. The Texas sentences added another formal judgment for each of the 23 murders. By 2025, the criminal proceedings had therefore reached a point of finality in terms of responsibility and punishment. Patrick Crusius had admitted guilt. The federal court had imposed 90 consecutive life sentences. The state of Texas had imposed 23 additional life sentences. But the conclusion of a criminal case is not the same thing as the conclusion of its human consequences. For the families of the victims, the survivors, and the community of El Paso, the courtroom could provide a judgment, but it could not provide a reversal of history. The legal record could explain what Patrick Crusius had done and why prosecutors considered it a hate crime. It could document the charges, the guilty pleas, and the sentences. Yet the most important fact remained outside the language of the courtroom. 23 people were dead, 22 others had been injured, and the reason they became targets was rooted in an ideology that Crusius had deliberately transformed into violence. The federal and state proceedings established accountability. They did not erase the tragedy, and that distinction would remain at the center of the case long after the final sentence had been pronounced. The courtroom proceedings eventually produced a clear legal conclusion. But a criminal sentence is not the same thing as an ending. For the people who were killed at the Cielo Vista Walmart, there could be no return to the lives they had been living before August 3, 2019. For the people who survived, the attack did not simply disappear when Patrick Crusius was arrested. And for the community of El Paso, the event remained a defining act of violence that had been directed at people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The final confirmed death toll was 23. 22 people had initially been confirmed dead after the shooting, while 22 others were injured. On April 25, 2020, one of those injured victims died, changing the official death toll from 22 to 23. That change is important because it reminds us that the consequences of an attack cannot always be measured at the exact moment the violence ends. The shooting itself occurred on one day. Its consequences continued afterward, and one of the most serious consequences was the loss of another life months later. The 23 victims became central to every subsequent stage of the case. Their names appeared in the official record, in the federal indictment, and in the state murder charges. Andrea Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo García, Guillermo García, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, María Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juarez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernandez, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Margia Ricard, Sara Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sanchez, and Juan Velasquez were no longer simply names belonging to private lives. They became part of a national criminal case because their lives had been taken in an attack that investigators established was motivated by hatred toward Hispanic people. Yet the legal record, by necessity, cannot capture everything that was lost. The supplied information does not provide detailed biographies for each victim, and it would be wrong to invent them. It is equally important not to manufacture conversations, final statements, personal histories, or imagined reactions. Doing so might make the story appear more intimate, but it would replace fact with fiction. What can be stated with certainty is that these 23 people were the human cost of a deliberate act of violence. The 22 injured survivors represent another part of that cost. Their injuries are confirmed, but the available information does not provide individual medical histories or detailed accounts of their recovery. For that reason, the consequences should not be exaggerated or described in ways that the evidence does not support. The facts are sufficient without embellishment. 22 people survived with injuries, and one injured victim later died. The attack, therefore, affected more people than the final death toll alone suggests. It also affected families, witnesses, investigators, and the wider community. The consequences were legal as well as human. The federal government treated the attack as a hate crime because the evidence established that Crusius had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. That determination mattered because it recognized a specific feature of the crime that would otherwise disappear behind the general description of a mass shooting. The victims were not merely people who happened to be present when violence erupted. According to Cruz's own later admission, their perceived or actual Hispanic national origin was part of the reason they were selected. The ideological context, therefore, became an essential part of the historical record. Cruz had described himself as a white nationalist and had expressed hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. His document, The Inconvenient Truth, was uploaded only minutes before the shooting and became an important piece of evidence. It provided investigators and prosecutors with a direct record of the beliefs he was expressing immediately before the attack. His later guilty plea reinforced the connection between those beliefs and the violence. In that sense, one of the most consequential findings of the investigation was not simply identifying the perpetrator. It was establishing the relationship between ideology, target selection, and violence. The case demonstrated a progression that was documented through the evidence. Cruz acquired a rifle and approximately 1,000 rounds of ammunition in June 2019. He traveled from Allen to El Paso. He selected a location associated in his mind with a large Hispanic population. He uploaded his ideological document, and he then attacked people inside the Cielo Vista Walmart. Each fact stood on its own, but together they created a coherent picture of deliberate preparation. The consequences also extended into the legal system in a way that reflected the scale and character of the attack. The federal indictment contained 90 counts. 23 involved hate crimes resulting in death, corresponding to the 23 people who ultimately died. 23 more involved firearm offenses connected to violent crimes resulting in death. 22 involve hate crimes connected to attempted killings, corresponding to the 22 people who survived their injuries. Another 22 involved firearm offenses connected to those violent crimes. The indictment therefore preserved the distinction between the victims rather than treating the attack as a single undifferentiated event. When Cruz pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges on February 8, 2023, the case moved from investigation and prosecution to punishment. On July 7, 2023, he received 90 consecutive life sentences. 45 were associated with hate crime offenses and 45 with firearm offenses. The sentence meant that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life under the federal judgment. The later Texas proceedings added another layer of accountability. On April 21, 2025, Cruz pleaded guilty to 23 murder charges in state court and received 23 life sentences. The distinction between the two sets of proceedings is important, but the practical conclusion is straightforward. Cruz would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The legal consequences were therefore definitive, but they did not erase the human consequences. A sentence cannot restore a person who has been killed. It cannot remove an injury. It cannot undo the decision that brought a gunman hundreds of miles from Allen to El Paso. It can only establish responsibility and impose punishment within the law. That is an important function, but it is not the same as healing. The case also carries a broader consequence for the way crimes motivated by extremist ideology are understood. The investigation did not need to rely entirely on speculation about what Cruz believed. His own written document and later admissions provided evidence of the ideology and its relationship to the attack. This makes the case particularly important as an example of how investigators can distinguish between a general allegation of extremism and a documented connection between ideology and criminal conduct. At the same time, the existence of an extremist ideology should not be used as an excuse to construct a psychological profile that the evidence does not support. The supplied information does not establish every aspect of Cruz's mental state, nor does it justify assumptions about motives beyond those documented in the case. Responsible storytelling requires that distinction. It is possible to acknowledge the role of white nationalist beliefs and anti-Hispanic hostility, without pretending to know every thought inside the perpetrator's mind. It is possible to explain the preparation without glorifying it. It is possible to describe the weapon without turning it into the focus of the story. And it is possible to examine the criminal investigation without allowing the perpetrator to become the most important character. The consequences of the El Paso attack ultimately belong to more than the man who carried it out. They belong to the 23 people whose lives were taken, the 22 people who were injured, and the families and community members who were forced to live with the aftermath. They belong to the investigators who reconstructed what happened, and to the courts that eventually imposed punishment. They also belong to the historical record, where the attack remains an example of how an ideological belief can become a deliberate act of violence against people who have been reduced, in the mind of an attacker, to a category that is perhaps the most important consequence to recognize. The crime did not begin when the first shots were fired. The evidence shows a process that began earlier, with beliefs, preparation, a journey, and a deliberate choice of target. The violence inside the Walmart was the final expression of that process. And when the gunfire ended, the consequences continued, first in the investigation, then in the courtroom, and finally in the lives of everyone left behind. The numbers tell us how large the tragedy was: 23 dead, 22 injured, 90 federal counts, 90 consecutive life sentences, 23 additional life sentences under Texas law. But numbers cannot tell us everything. They cannot tell us who each victim was beyond the name preserved in the record. And they cannot measure the absence created by a death. What they can do is establish the scale of what happened. The responsibility of remembering the case is then to look beyond the numbers without inventing what the evidence does not provide. Patrick Crusius committed a deliberate act of violence rooted in an ideology that targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The courts established his responsibility. But the final measure of the case is not the number of sentences imposed on him. It is the number of lives that cannot be restored, 23. The story of Patrick Crusius and the El Paso Walmart attack is on the surface a story about a mass shooting, a criminal investigation, a federal prosecution, and a series of life sentences. But those descriptions, while accurate, are not enough to explain why the case remains significant. The deeper meaning lies in the sequence that connected an ideology to a deliberate act of violence, and in the human consequences that followed. On August 3, 2019, 23 people ultimately lost their lives, 22 others were injured, and a community was forced to confront an attack motivated by hostility toward people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. Patrick Crusius did not simply arrive in El Paso and suddenly decide to shoot. The evidence described in the case establishes a progression that began before the attack itself. In June 2019, he purchased a GPWASR 10 semi-automatic rifle and approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow-point ammunition. He lived in Allen, Texas, but he chose to travel hundreds of miles to El Paso. The location was significant because he believed the city had a large Hispanic population. Shortly before the attack, he uploaded a document called The Inconvenient Truth to the internet. The document expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants, including the belief that Hispanic people were responsible for what he described as a cultural and ethnic replacement. Then he entered the Cielo Vista Walmart and opened fire. The sequence matters because it demonstrates the difference between an event that happens in an instant and a crime that has been building through a series of decisions. The shooting itself may be measured in the immediate consequences of deaths and injuries, but the preparation began earlier. The weapon was acquired earlier. The ammunition was acquired earlier. The journey was undertaken deliberately. The location was selected deliberately. The ideological document was published immediately before the attack. Each step narrowed the distance between belief and action. None of this means that every person who holds extremist beliefs will become violent. It would be irresponsible to make such a claim, and the available evidence does not support it. What this case demonstrates is something more specific. In this particular instance, The documented beliefs of one individual became part of a deliberate plan to target people because of their perceived or actual Hispanic national origin. That distinction is essential. The investigation did not need to turn ideology into a vague explanation for violence. The evidence provided a direct connection. Cruges himself later admitted that he targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. He also admitted that he intended to kill the people he shot. His guilty plea, therefore, became an important part of the historical record because it confirmed what investigators had already been building through the evidence. The document he uploaded before the shooting provided ideological context. The firearm and ammunition purchases provided evidence of preparation. The journey from Allen to El Paso connected preparation to the selected location. The attack itself established the consequences. His later admission connected those elements through motive and intent. That chain is what made the federal hate crime prosecution possible. The investigation also demonstrates why the details of a criminal case must be separated into confirmed facts and speculation. There are many questions that people may want answered when confronted with a crime of this magnitude. They may want to know every detail of the perpetrator's psychology, every thought that passed through his mind, every emotion experienced by people inside the store, or every detail of the moments surrounding the shooting. But when those details are not established by the available evidence, inventing them does not make the story more complete. It makes the story less reliable. The facts already provide enough to understand the crime. Patrick Cruges planned the attack. He traveled to El Paso because of the city's Hispanic population. He published an ideological document shortly before the shooting. He entered the Walmart and killed and injured people. He was arrested shortly afterward. Investigators established the connection between his beliefs and his actions. He was charged with 90 federal offenses. He pleaded guilty to all 90. He received 90 consecutive life sentences. Later, he pleaded guilty to 23 murder charges in Texas and received 23 additional life sentences. There is no need to embellish those facts. The numbers themselves are difficult to comprehend. 90 federal counts, 90 consecutive life sentences, 23 people dead, 22 injured, 23 additional murder charges in state court. Yet even those numbers can create a kind of distance. A statistic is easier to process than a human life. That is why the names of the victims matter. Andrés Chondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo Garcia, Guillermo Garcia, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglesby, Maria Flores, Raul Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernandez, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juarez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernandez, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Margie Record, Sarah Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sanchez, Juan Velázquez. These names are the permanent human record beneath the legal language. They are not simply the 23 murder counts in the Texas case. They are not merely the 23 deaths in the federal indictment. They are the people whose lives were ended by the attack. The fact that the available information does not provide complete biographies for each of them does not make their identities less important. It simply means that responsible storytelling must respect the boundary between what is known and what is not known. The same principle applies to the 22 people who survived with injuries. Their experiences were part of the consequences of the attack. But the supplied information does not provide detailed accounts of their individual injuries or recovery. Their existence should therefore be acknowledged without inventing details about their lives. This restraint is particularly important in true crime storytelling because the subject itself can tempt a narrator towards sensationalism. A crime involving an extremist ideology, a mass shooting, and dozens of victims can easily become a story dominated by the person who committed it. The perpetrator's name can become more familiar than the names of those who died. His ideology can receive more attention than the lives that ideology targeted. His preparation can become more fascinating than the people affected by the consequences. But that is not the only way to tell the story, and it is not the most responsible way. The central fact of the El Paso case is not that Patrick Crusius became notorious. It is that 23 people died because he deliberately transformed an extremist belief into violence. The legal system eventually provided a clear conclusion. On February 8, 2023, Crusius pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges. On July 7, 2023, he was sentenced to 90 consecutive life sentences. On April 21, 2025, he pleaded guilty in Texas to 23 murder charges and received 23 life sentences. The courts therefore established responsibility at both the federal and state levels. But punishment has limits. A life sentence cannot return the dead. It cannot remove the injuries suffered by survivors. It cannot reverse the journey from Allen to El Paso. It cannot erase the document that was uploaded before the attack or the ideology that inspired the target selection. What a sentence can do is establish accountability. It can state, through the authority of the law, that the actions committed on August 3, 2019 were crimes, and that the person responsible would be held accountable for them. The final lesson of the case is therefore not simply about punishment. It is about the path from belief to action and the importance of recognizing the difference between understanding a motive and excusing a crime. The evidence allows us to understand why Crusius chose El Paso and why he targeted people he believed were Hispanic. Understanding that motive does not diminish his responsibility. If anything, it clarifies it. The attack was deliberate. The victims were deliberately selected. The preparation occurred before the shooting. The ideological document appeared immediately before the violence. And the perpetrator later admitted what he had intended to do. The case is therefore a reminder of how important evidence is when reconstructing a crime. It prevents speculation from becoming history. It allows investigators to distinguish between what is known and what is merely assumed. And it gives the victims a record that does not depend on sensationalism. In the end, the story returns to the same place where it began, the Cielo Vista Walmart in El Paso. On August 3, 2019, 23 people ultimately died. 22 others were injured. Patrick Crusius was arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The legal process is complete in its essential conclusion, but the human consequences cannot be measured by the closing of a courtroom case. The most important memory of this tragedy should not be the number of sentences imposed on the perpetrator, nor should it be the ideology he tried to promote. It should be the recognition that every person killed was more than a statistic, and every person who survived was more than a line in an indictment. The names remain, the facts remain, and so does the responsibility to tell the story without turning violence into spectacle. Patrick Crusius's actions can be understood through the evidence, preparation, movement, target selection, ideology, violence, admission, conviction, and punishment. But understanding the sequence does not make the tragedy easier to accept. 23 people are still dead. 22 others were injured. No sentence can change that. What remains is the historical record and the obligation to remember what that record actually says. This was a deliberate act of violence motivated by hatred, carried out against people who had been reduced by the attacker to an identity he had chosen to hate. The final measure of the case is therefore not the notoriety of the man who committed it. It is the lives that were taken, the people who survived, and the enduring importance of remembering them as human beings rather than numbers. There is a point in every criminal case when the investigation stops asking what happened and the courtroom stops asking whether the accused was responsible. The evidence has been gathered. The charges have been filed. The defendant has entered a plea. The sentence has been imposed. On paper, the case appears to have reached its final page. The story of Patrick Crusius, however, is more complicated than a final judgment. The legal record may now be clear, but the human consequences of the August 3, 2019 attack at the Cielo Vista Walmart cannot be reduced to the moment when a judge pronounced a sentence. The final record begins with 23 names. It includes 22 people who were injured. It includes an investigation that traced the attack back to preparations made weeks earlier. It includes a federal prosecution involving 90 separate counts, followed by 90 consecutive life sentences. It includes a later Texas prosecution involving 23 murder charges and 23 additional life sentences. But beneath all of those numbers is one central fact. Patrick Crusius deliberately turned an ideological belief into violence against people he had selected because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The importance of that fact becomes clearer when the case is viewed from beginning to end. In June 2019, Crusius purchased a GPWSR-10 semi-automatic rifle through the internet and obtained approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow-point ammunition. Those purchases established that preparation had taken place before the shooting. Then came the journey from Allen to El Paso. The distance between those two places was not incidental. Crusius traveled hundreds of miles toward a city he had selected because he believed it contained a large Hispanic population. The location, therefore, became part of the motive. The attack was not simply violence that happened to occur in El Paso. According to the evidence and his later admission, El Paso was chosen because of the people he expected to encounter there. Then, only minutes before the shooting, Crusius uploaded the inconvenient truth to the internet. The document expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. It described the ideas that Crusius used to justify his actions, including his belief that Hispanic people were responsible for what he called a cultural and ethnic replacement. The timing of the document matters. It appeared immediately before the attack, connecting the written ideology to the act that followed. It became one of the clearest pieces of evidence available to investigators when they attempted to understand motive. Then came the shooting itself. Crusius entered the Cielo Vista Walmart carrying the rifle and ammunition and began shooting at people inside. 22 people were initially confirmed dead. 22 others were injured. The final death toll became 23 when one injured victim died on April 25, 2020. The identities of those who died became permanently attached to the official history of the attack. André Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo García, Guillermo García, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, María Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juarez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernandez, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Marquez, Margie Record, Sarah Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodriguez, Teresa Sanchez, and Juan Velasquez. Their names are important because the legal system inevitably transformed their deaths into categories. 23 deaths became 23 counts. 22 surviving victims became another group of federal charges. But the people themselves were never categories. They were individuals whose lives were interrupted by a decision made long before the shooting began. After the attack, Crusius left the Walmart but did not disappear into a prolonged escape. According to the supplied case information, he approached police and was arrested shortly afterward. That arrest changed the nature of the case. Investigators no longer needed to determine who the attacker was. They needed to reconstruct what had led him to El Paso and establish the legal significance of what he had done. The FBI, El Paso Police Department, ATF, Texas Department of Public Safety, El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and law enforcement agencies in Allen and Dallas became part of that investigation. Their work focused on the preparation, the weapon and ammunition, the journey, the target, the document, the victims, and the motive. Each element reinforced the others. The firearm purchase demonstrated preparation. The journey demonstrated deliberate movement toward the selected location. The document demonstrated ideological motivation. The attack demonstrated the consequences. and Cruz's later admission provided a direct statement of intent and motive. He acknowledged that he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. He also acknowledged that he intended to kill the people he shot. Those admissions became central to the federal prosecution. The legal case that followed was extensive. In February 2020, a federal grand jury returned an indictment containing 90 counts. 23 counts involved hate crimes resulting in death. 23 involved firearm offenses connected to federal violent crimes resulting in death. 22 involved hate crimes connected to attempted killings. Another 22 involved firearm offenses connected to those violent crimes. The 90 counts reflected the individual victims and the different federal offenses arising from the same attack. The case therefore moved from the physical scene of the Walmart into a legal structure designed to account for each part of the violence. On February 8, 2023, Cruz pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges. That plea meant that the federal case did not need to proceed through a full trial on all of those counts. He accepted responsibility for the offenses, including the hate crime allegations and the firearm charges. On July 7, 2023, he was sentenced to 90 consecutive life sentences. 45 of those sentences were associated with the hate crime offenses, while 45 were associated with the firearm offenses. The punishment ensured that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. Yet the federal sentence did not erase the separate authority of the state of Texas to prosecute the murders. The state case continued. On April 21, 2025, Cruz pleaded guilty to 23 murder charges in Texas and received 23 life sentences. The two legal proceedings therefore created two separate layers of accountability. Federal law addressed the hate crimes and firearm offenses. Texas law addressed the 23 murders. Together, they established the final legal record of responsibility. But perhaps the most important thing about that record is what it does not say. It does not say that the sentences repaired the damage. It does not say that a courtroom could restore the 23 lives that were lost. It does not say that the injuries suffered by 22 survivors could simply be placed in the past. A sentence establishes punishment. It does not reverse history. That distinction is essential when telling a case like this. True crime can easily become centered on the offender because the offender is the person around whom the investigation and prosecution are organized. But the legal system's focus on the defendant should not determine the moral focus of the story. The moral focus remains with the victims. Patrick Cruz's name is part of the historical record because he committed the crime. The names of the 23 people who died are part of the record because they were the people whose lives were taken. Those are fundamentally different reasons for remembering someone. The case also offers a lesson in the importance of precision. The available evidence establishes that Cruz held white nationalist beliefs, expressed hostility toward Hispanic immigrants, selected El Paso because of its Hispanic population, prepared for the attack, uploaded his documents shortly before the shooting, carried out the violence, and later admitted his motive and intent. Those facts are enough to understand the crime. There is no need to invent a hidden psychological explanation or create dialogue that does not exist in the record. There is no need to dramatize the attack beyond what the confirmed evidence tells us. The reality is already severe. 23 people died. 22 were injured. The attacker was prosecuted under both federal and state law. He pleaded guilty. He received 90 consecutive federal life sentences and 23 additional state life sentences. The legal process established responsibility, but memory requires something more than a judgment. It requires keeping the victims visible. The final record of the El Paso attack should therefore contain more than the name of Patrick Cruz and the number 90. It should preserve the names of the 23 people who died. It should acknowledge the 22 people who were injured. It should recognize the investigators who reconstructed the crime and the legal system that established accountability. And it should remain precise about what is known and what is not known. The tragedy began with an ideology that turned people into targets. It became a physical act of violence through preparation and deliberate choice. It became a criminal case through evidence. And it became a matter of legal responsibility through guilty pleas and sentences. But the story does not need to glorify the man responsible in order to explain what he did. His actions can be examined without making him the center of remembrance. In the end, the most enduring part of the story is not the weapon, the manifesto, the indictment, or even the extraordinary number of life sentences. It is the human cost. 23 people lost their lives. 22 others survived with injuries. Their names remain in the record. Their deaths cannot be undone. And that is where the story of Patrick Crusius should ultimately end. Not with the notoriety of the perpetrator, but with a reminder that behind every count in a criminal indictment was a human being, and behind every sentence imposed was a life that could never be restored. What the case revealed, the Patrick Crusius case, can be understood through a sequence of facts that became increasingly difficult to separate from one another. A weapon was purchased. Ammunition was obtained. A journey was made from Allen to El Paso. A location was selected because of its Hispanic population. An ideological document was uploaded only minutes before the shooting. Then, inside the Cielo Vista Walmart, 23 people ultimately lost their lives and 22 others were injured. Afterward came the arrest, the investigation, the federal indictment, the guilty plea, and the sentences that would keep Crusius in prison for the remainder of his life. Seen separately, each fact explains only one part of the case. Seen together, they reveal the structure of a deliberate, hate-motivated attack. One of the most important lessons is the distinction between motive and action. Investigators did not have to assume that Crusius's beliefs were connected to the violence simply because he had expressed extremist views. The evidence established a much more direct relationship. His written document expressed white nationalist beliefs and hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. He had selected El Paso because he believed the city had a large Hispanic population. He then attacked people inside a Walmart. Later, he admitted that he had targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. The connection was therefore supported by both documentary evidence and his own admission. That distinction matters because motive can sometimes become a vague explanation imposed on a crime after the fact. In this case, the available information provides something stronger. The perpetrator himself acknowledged the reason for targeting his victims. His admission also addressed intent. He acknowledged that he intended to kill the people he shot. That meant the legal case could be understood not merely as an act of indiscriminate violence, but as an intentional attack against people selected according to an identity the perpetrator associated with his ideology. The federal prosecution reflected that distinction. The 90-count indictment divided the crime into separate categories corresponding to the people killed, the people injured, the hate crime allegations, and the firearm offenses. 23 counts concerned hate crimes resulting in death. 23 more concerned firearm offenses associated with violent crimes resulting in death. 22 counts concerned hate crimes involving attempted killings, while another 22 involved firearm offenses associated with those violent crimes. The indictment therefore preserved something that large numbers can easily conceal. The attack consisted of individual acts against individual people. The number 90 describes the legal structure, but it does not describe the human experience. Behind those counts were 23 people who would never return to their families and communities. Behind the attempted killing charges were 22 people who survived the attack but were injured. The eventual death of one injured victim on April 25, 2020, also demonstrated that the consequences of violence can continue beyond the day on which it occurs. The death toll initially stood at 22 before becoming 23. That change altered the legal record, but it also reinforced a basic truth about the attack. The effects did not end when Crusius left the Walmart. The investigation that followed had to reconstruct events that had already been set in motion weeks earlier. The June 2019 purchase of the GPWASR 10 and approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition became part of that reconstruction. These facts demonstrated preparation. They helped distinguish the attack from an impulsive act that began and ended within a single moment. The journey from Allen to El Paso added another layer. Cruzes did not select a location close to home and then discover the population he wanted to target. According to the case information, he traveled to El Paso because he believed there were many Hispanic people there. The geographical distance, therefore, became evidence of deliberate target selection. The final link was the document uploaded before the shooting. The inconvenient truth was not merely an expression of political opinion discovered in isolation. Its timing gave it particular significance. It was posted only minutes before the attack. Its contents expressed the ideology that Cruzes used to explain or justify his actions. Investigators could therefore examine the document alongside the physical preparation and the actual violence. The result was a documented progression from ideology to preparation, from preparation to movement, and from movement to action. That progression is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case because it demonstrates how a violent act can emerge through a series of decisions rather than appearing without warning. Yet the case also requires caution when discussing causation. The available evidence establishes what Cruzes believed and what he did. It does not establish that every person exposed to similar ideas will become violent. It does not justify a broad psychological theory about extremist beliefs. And it does not provide enough information to describe every aspect of Cruzes' mental state. A responsible account must resist the temptation to fill those gaps with assumptions. The facts are powerful enough without speculation. This is especially important when discussing the perpetrator himself. True crime narratives can unintentionally turn offenders into central characters whose personalities, possessions, statements, and actions receive more attention than the people they harmed. In the El Paso case, that would create a distorted picture. Patrick Cruzes is essential to understanding the crime because he committed it, but the victims are essential to understanding why the crime matters. Their identities should not disappear beneath the notoriety of the offender. The 23 people who died were Andre Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo Garcia, Guillermo Garcia, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, Maria Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juárez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernández, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Márquez, Margie Recard, Sara Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodríguez, Teresa Sánchez, and Juan Velázquez. The official record preserves those names because they were the people whose lives were taken. Their presence in the case should not be reduced to the number 23. At the same time, the 22 injured survivors remain an important part of the story. The available information does not provide detailed accounts of their individual experiences, so those details should not be invented. But their injuries establish that the consequences of the attack extended beyond the people who died. The case therefore involved both irreversible loss and survival after violence. The legal outcome eventually became unusually extensive. On February 8, 2023, Cruzes pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges. On July 7, 2023, he was sentenced to 90 consecutive life sentences, with 45 associated with hate crime offenses and 45 associated with firearm offenses. The federal punishment ensured that he would remain in prison for life. But the state case continued. On April 21, 2025, Cruzes pleaded guilty in Texas to 23 murder charges and received 23 life sentences. These proceedings were separate, but together they provided a comprehensive legal response to the attack. Federal law addressed the hate crimes and firearm offenses. Texas law addressed the murders. The resulting sentences made one fact unmistakable. There would be no return to ordinary life for Patrick Crusius. Yet even such severe punishment has a limit. The law can impose consequences on the person responsible, but it cannot restore what was lost. It cannot return the 23 victims to their families. It cannot erase the injuries suffered by survivors. It cannot remove the memory of August 3rd, 2019. What the legal system can do is establish responsibility and preserve a factual record. That record matters because memory can otherwise become distorted. Over time, a complex case can be reduced to a few numbers or a single shocking phrase. The El Paso attack deserves more precision than that. It was not simply a shooting. It was an attack that prosecutors established as a hate crime. It was not simply an act that happened in a moment. The evidence showed preparation beginning weeks earlier. It was not simply a case of an unknown attacker disappearing after the violence. Crusius was arrested shortly afterward and ultimately admitted responsibility. It was not simply a federal case. It also resulted in state murder convictions and life sentences. And it was not a tragedy defined only by the perpetrator. It was defined by the people who were killed and injured. Perhaps the clearest way to understand the case is to follow the chain without breaking it apart. Belief, preparation, target selection, action, investigation, admission, and accountability. Crusius's ideology alone did not produce the criminal case. His actions did. His preparations mattered because they demonstrated intent. His choice of El Paso mattered because it connected the attack to his hostility toward Hispanic people. His document mattered because it recorded the ideology he expressed immediately before the shooting. His later guilty plea mattered because he acknowledged the motive and the intention to kill. The sentences mattered because they established the legal consequences. Every stage reinforced the next. And yet the final meaning of the case remains human rather than numerical. The 23 people who died cannot be brought back by any judgment. The 22 people who were injured cannot have the event erased from history simply because the perpetrator was sentenced. The legal system reached its conclusions, but the human story remains defined by absence, survival, and remembrance. The case therefore leaves behind two records. One is the criminal record, 90 federal counts, 90 consecutive life sentences, 23 Texas murder charges, and 23 additional life sentences. The other is the human record, 23 lives ended and 22 people injured by a deliberate act of violence rooted in hatred. The second record is the one that should remain at the center. Because when the legal language is stripped away, the essential truth is painfully simple. A person carried an ideology into action, chose a population as a target, and turned individual human beings into victims of that belief. The courts established responsibility. History must preserve the names of those who paid the price. The lasting legacy of El Paso, the final chapter of the Patrick Crusius case, does not belong entirely to the courtroom. By the time the federal and state proceedings had reached their conclusions, the legal facts were established with unusual clarity. Crusius had carried out the August 3rd, 2019 attack at the Cielo Vista Walmart in El Paso. 23 people had ultimately died, 22 others had been injured, and investigators had established that the attack was motivated by hostility toward people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. Crusius pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges on February 8, 2023, and on July 7, 2023. Received 90 consecutive life sentences. On April 21, 2025, he pleaded guilty in Texas to 23 murder charges and received 23 additional life sentences. Legally, there was little ambiguity left, but a criminal judgment does not erase the event that produced it. The final legacy of El Paso, therefore, has to be understood through the facts that remain after the courtroom has closed. The first and most important fact is the human cost. 23 people lost their lives: Andre Anchondo, Jordan Anchondo, Arturo Benavides, Jorge Calvillo García, Guillermo García, Leonardo Campos, Angelina Inglisbe, María Flores, Raúl Flores, Adolfo Cerros Hernández, Alexander Hoffman, David Johnson, Luis Alfonso Juarez, Maria Legarreta Roth, Maribel Loya Hernandez, Ivan Filiberto Manzano, Gloria Irma Marquez, Elsa Mendoza Márquez, Margie Recard, Sara Regalado Monreal, Javier Amir Rodríguez, Teresa Sánchez, and Juan Velázquez. These names are not merely evidence in a prosecution. They represent the people whose lives were permanently interrupted. The final death toll was not even known immediately. 22 people were initially confirmed dead, while 22 others were injured. On April 25, 2020, one of the injured victims died, bringing the total number of deaths to 23. That detail is a reminder that the consequences of violence can extend beyond the day when the violence occurs. A case may appear to have a fixed number of victims, yet the human consequences can continue to unfold long afterward. The 22 survivors also remain part of that record. The available information does not provide detailed accounts of their individual injuries or later lives, and responsible storytelling should not invent those details. But their inclusion in the federal charges is significant. The attack did not end with the 23 deaths. 22 other people were injured, and their survival became another part of the legal and human history of August 3, 2019. The second lasting element of the case is the documented relationship between extremist ideology and deliberate target selection. Cruges described himself as a white nationalist and expressed hostility toward Hispanic immigrants. His document, The Inconvenient Truth, was uploaded only minutes before the shooting. It expressed his belief in what he described as cultural and ethnic replacement and provided an ideological explanation for the violence he was about to commit. The importance of that document is not that it offers some complete explanation of the perpetrator's personality. It does not. The available evidence does not justify speculation about every aspect of his psychology, nor does it allow us to explain extremist violence through a single theory. Its importance is narrower and more concrete. It documented the beliefs that Cruges was expressing immediately before the attack and helped establish the motive that prosecutors later presented as a federal hate crime. His own guilty plea reinforced that conclusion. Cruges admitted that he targeted people because of their actual or perceived Hispanic national origin. He also admitted that he intended to kill the people he shot. Those admissions removed much of the uncertainty that might otherwise surround the question of motive. The evidence, therefore, created a direct connection between what Cruges believed, where he went, whom he targeted, and what he did. That connection is perhaps the most important historical feature of the case. The third lasting element is the preparation that preceded the attack. In June 2019, Cruges purchased a GPWASR 10 semi-automatic rifle and approximately 1,000 rounds of hollow point ammunition. Weeks later, he traveled from Allen to El Paso. He selected the city because he believed it contained a large Hispanic population. Then, immediately before the shooting, he uploaded his ideological document. These facts form a timeline that is difficult to describe as spontaneous. The violence inside the Walmart was the culmination of decisions made beforehand. That does not mean the case provides an explanation for every step in the attack, and it does not justify inventing details that are absent from the record. It does mean that investigators were able to reconstruct enough of the preparation to establish deliberate conduct. The fourth lasting element is the role of the investigation itself. After Cruges left the Walmart, he did not disappear into a prolonged escape. He approached police and was arrested shortly after the attack. That allowed investigators to focus on reconstructing the crime rather than identifying an unknown suspect. The FBI, El Paso Police Department, ATF, Texas Department of Public Safety, El Paso County Sheriff's Office, and law enforcement agencies in Allen and Dallas participated in the investigation. Their work connected the weapon and ammunition purchases, the journey from Allen, the selected location, the ideological document, the victims, and Cruges' own statements. What had initially been a chaotic mass shooting became a documented criminal case. The fifth lasting element is the legal distinction between federal and state responsibility. The federal prosecution addressed 90 offenses, including hate crimes and firearm offenses. The state prosecution addressed 23 murders. The two systems reached their conclusions separately, but both produced life sentences. The federal court imposed 90 consecutive life sentences, while the Texas court imposed 23 life sentences. These numbers are extraordinary, but their importance is not simply numerical. They demonstrate how the justice system divided the attack into individual acts and offenses. 23 deaths were not treated as one anonymous statistic. They were reflected in separate charges. The 22 injured survivors were also represented in the federal indictment. The legal record therefore preserved the scale of the crime while maintaining the individuality of its victims. There is, however, a danger in allowing the extraordinary numbers to become the story themselves. 90 life sentences can attract attention because the figure is so large. The indictment can become fascinating because of its complexity. The ideology can become the focus because it is disturbing. Even the perpetrator's name can become more memorable than the names of the people he killed. That is why the final reflection on El Paso should resist sensationalism. The significance of the case is not that Patrick Crusius became infamous. It is that his actions caused irreversible harm to people who had been selected because of an identity he had chosen to hate. The legal record is necessary, but it should not overwhelm the human record. A responsible account must also maintain the distinction between confirmed facts and assumptions. The confirmed facts establish preparation, target selection, ideology, violence, arrest, prosecution, guilty pleas, and sentencing. They establish the final death toll and the number of injured victims. They establish the federal and state outcomes. But they do not provide every detail about what individual victims were thinking, every emotion experienced by survivors, or every aspect of Crusius's private psychological state. Those gaps should remain gaps rather than being filled with invented material. In a true crime narrative, restraint is not a weakness. It is part of accuracy and respect. The final legacy of the El Paso attack is therefore not a mystery waiting to be solved. The central questions have already been answered. The perpetrator has been identified. His preparation was documented. His motive was established. His responsibility was admitted. His punishment was imposed. What remains is the question of how the event should be remembered. The answer lies with the victims. 23 people died. 22 others were injured. Their lives should not be reduced to the crime committed against them. At the same time, the available record cannot reconstruct every detail of who they were or what they experienced. What it can preserve is their names, the fact that they were targeted, and the fact that their deaths became the center of one of the most significant federal hate crime prosecutions in recent American history. There is also a broader lesson in the sequence of events. The attack demonstrates that violence motivated by extremist ideology can have a visible chain of preparation. Acquiring a weapon, obtaining ammunition, selecting a destination, identifying a population as a target, expressing an ideological justification, and then acting. The case does not provide a universal formula for predicting violence, and it would be wrong to claim that every extremist belief inevitably leads to criminal action. But in this particular case, the connection between ideology and violence was not merely theoretical. It was documented by the evidence and acknowledged by the perpetrator himself. That is what makes the case so difficult to dismiss as an inexplicable moment of chaos. It was a deliberate act with identifiable preparation and a stated motive. In the end, the story of Patrick Crusius reaches its final page with a paradox. The perpetrator received a punishment that will keep him in prison for life. Yet the most important people in the story are the ones who cannot return to their lives. The courts could impose accountability, but they could not restore what was lost. The investigation could reconstruct the sequence of events, but it could not reverse them. The guilty pleas could establish responsibility, but they could not erase the pain left behind. What remains is memory. And memory, when it is handled responsibly, does not need exaggeration. It does not need invented dialogue or dramatic speculation. It needs facts, names, context, and respect. The El Paso Walmart attack was a deliberate act of violence motivated by hatred toward Hispanic people. 23 people died. 22 were injured. Patrick Cruges was arrested, pleaded guilty, and received life sentences under both federal and Texas law. Those facts are the permanent foundation of the story. Beyond them lies a responsibility shared by anyone who tells it, to remember the victims as people, to describe the crime without glorifying the perpetrator, and to recognize that behind every statistic was an individual life. The final legacy of the case is therefore not the number 90, nor the notoriety of the man who committed the attack. It is the names that remain, the lives that were lost, the survivors who were injured, and the historical record that ensures the events of August 3rd, 2019 are remembered for what they were: a deliberate act of hate whose consequences extended far beyond the walls of a Walmart and far beyond the day on which the shooting occurred.